Anti-slavery movement. People disagreed about the issue of slavery. Some felt that slaves were needed to grow cash crops, and some felt that it was wrong to enslave people. People who joined the movement to abolish or end slavery were called abolitionists. Abolitionists were white, free blacks, men, and women. The abolitionist movement grew quickly in the 1830s and 1840s. The Underground Railroad. Some abolitionists worked together to help slaves escape to freedom. They formed a system known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a series of escape routes and hiding places for slaves to travel through. Attempting to escape slavery took great courage. Runaways who were caught were punished and returned to slavery. Slave states versus free states. As the United States grew, Congress had to decide whether to allow slavery in each territory. Slave states were states that permitted slavery, and free states were states that did not permit slavery. Congress tried to keep an equal number of free states and slave states. On this map, you see the United States as it was in the year 1861. The map shows you the different states and territories that were present during that time. The red states represent the slave states, which were the states that had slavery. The light blue states are the states that did not have slavery. You also have slave territories and free territories, which were the areas of the United States that had not been designated specifically as certain states. And at the bottom, you see the free and slave states as it is listed from year to year and how some grew and some decreased. Compromise and conflict. Congress argued over which territories would have slavery. Northerners wanted to have a lot of representatives in Congress so they could pass laws against slavery. Southerners wanted more slave states. The Missouri Compromise is where Missouri could be a slave state and Maine would be a free state. Congress created an invisible line across the rest of the territories. Territories south of the line would allow slavery. Popular sovereignty. In the Compromise of 1850, Congress allowed settlers to make the decision about slavery for themselves. The right of people to make political decisions for themselves is called popular sovereignty. On this map, you see the Compromise of 1850 illustrated. The green areas represent the free states and territories, all of which were states and territories that did not support slavery. The yellow areas represent the slave states, so all of those are states that do support and represent slavery. The pinkish, purplish areas are those territories that were open to slavery by popular sovereignty in the Compromise of 1850. So these two territories, the settlers in those areas were able to choose whether or not they wanted to have slaves or they did not have slaves. That was completely their choice. On the map, you can also see the Missouri Compromise line. On the previous slide, we talked about that invisible line that Congress had drawn across the United States. All states below that line represent slave states. Fugitive slave law. As part of the Compromise of 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law. A fugitive is a person who was running away. This law said that slaves who escaped slavery had to be returned to slavery. This law also required citizens to help catch fugitives. This law upset Northerners, and many refused to obey the law. So basically here, if you are a slave that had escaped and you were on the run, you were considered a fugitive. And if you were caught, you had to be returned to slavery. And this meant, as a part of this law, that citizens, people who were just living in the North that did not support slavery, they were required to return you back to the South to your slave owner, and they did not like that, so they refused to obey the law. Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe began writing a story about slavery. She wanted to help people in the North to understand better the realities of slavery. Initially, a new portion of the story came out each week in a newspaper called the National Era. The story became very popular, and the installments were published as an entire book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. The story follows the horrible life of a slave named Tom. The book became a national bestseller. It was not only popular in the United States, but also around the world. People in the North who had not really thought about slavery before began to understand just how horrible it was. Many people joined the abolitionist movement as a result of reading the book. They wanted slavery outlawed throughout the United States. The book helped lead to the beginning of the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. This law gave popular sovereignty to the Nebraska and Kansas territories. This law upset abolitionists because it gave territories north of the line created in the Missouri Compromise the right to have slaves. So if you think back to the previous slides that we've looked at, this Kansas-Nebraska Act gave that popular sovereignty now to the Kansas and Nebraska territories as well. This means that those people living in those territories were able to choose whether or not they wanted to support slavery or if they were still against it. It upset those abolitionists because before, these territories were above that Missouri Compromise line, which meant that they did not have slavery in those states. But now that they are having popular sovereignty, they can choose to have slavery. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. In 1859, around a year and a half before the start of the Civil War, abolitionist John Brown tried to lead a slave uprising in Virginia. On October 16, 1859, Brown gathered his small force together for the initial raid. There were 21 total men who participated in the raid: 16 white men, 3 freed black men, 1 freed slave, and 1 fugitive slave. The initial part of the raid was successful. Brown and his men captured the arsenal that night. However, Brown had planned on the local slaves coming to his aid. He expected that, once he had control of the weapons, hundreds of local slaves would join in the fight. This never happened. On October 18th, John Brown was captured by Robert E. Lee. If you look at the side of the slide, you'll see that I included an image of John Brown. So this is the man who began the first uprising to free slaves in the South. Why it all matters. By 1860, the North and South were very divided. As time went on, it became much harder for Americans to compromise over slavery. This conflict started to split the nation. So by 1860, the North and the South were very divided, and they could not agree or come to a compromise over slavery. So it really started to split North and South. Civil War uniforms. So, as you can imagine, in a battle between tens of thousands of men, things can get confusing. It even becomes difficult to know which soldier is on which side. The main way to tell the difference is by the uniforms. You've probably heard the blue and the gray when people talk about or refer to the Civil War sides. The Northern Union armies wore navy blue, and the Southern Confederate armies wore gray. However, the uniforms weren't exactly uniform at the start of the war. The Union uniform consisted of a dark blue wool coat with light blue trousers or pants and a dark cap called a forage cap. They typically wore shoes that went up to their ankles called brogans. The coat often had bright buttons that sometimes indicated the rank of the soldiers or what state they represented. Other markings on the coat, like piping or badges, usually indicated the rank of the soldier. For the Confederacy, the Confederate uniforms were less than standard as compared to the Union's. At the start of the war, many of the Confederate soldiers just wore their own clothes into battle. Eventually, they settled on a uniform that had a waist-length coat that was gray with light blue trousers. Due to costs and a lack of materials during the war, many Confederate soldiers did not have adequate uniforms. They often wore combinations of what they could find and steal, as well as their own clothes. They also did have very good shoes and sometimes had to go without any shoes at all. The Battle of Fort Sumter. After South Carolina seceded or separated from the Union, the Confederacy and the Confederate Army was formed. The Confederate Army began surrounding Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort with United States soldiers inside. The Confederate government wanted to control the fort, but Abraham Lincoln refused to surrender it. When the soldiers began to run out of supplies and food, Lincoln sent a ship with supplies to the fort. Lincoln hoped that the Southern states would return to the Union peacefully. Confederate leaders felt Lincoln's refusal to surrender Fort Sumter was an act of war. So on April 12, 1861, Confederate leaders fired cannons on the fort. The soldiers in the fort had to surrender after 34 hours. The importance of the Battle of Fort Sumter is that the attack marked the beginning of the Civil War. The First Battle of Bull Run. In July of 1861, the Union Army marched south from Washington. They were looking to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. On July 21st, the Union and Confederate armies fought at a stream called Bull Run. General Thomas Jackson led Confederate troops from the top of a hill. It is said that he held the hill like a stone wall. This gave him the nickname Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Now, I know you're probably thinking, was he actually holding up the wall? No. That just means that he was able to support his troops and they fought off the Union to defend their territory. The Confederate Army won this battle, but casualties were worse than ever expected. The battle made both sides, the Confederate and the Union, realize that this would be a long and horrible war. The importance of the Battle of Bull Run is that the Confederate and the Union realized that it would not be a quick, easy victory to win this war. One thing I want to point out here, the word casualties means deaths, and the Civil War is known as one of the bloodiest and deadliest wars in United States history. The Battle of the Ironclads, the Monitor, and the Merrimac. An ironclad was a new kind of warship that was made out of iron rather than wood. March 8th through the 9th of 1862, the Merrimac, which were the Confederates, and the Monitor, which was the Union, fired on each other for hours, but neither would sink. The importance of the Battle of the Ironclads. It was the first clash between ironclad warships. This changed the future of the naval warfare. And you can see by the illustration at the bottom of the slide that an ironclad warship was known as a submarine. The Battle of Antietam. September 17, 1862, the Union Army attacked the Confederate Army in Maryland. The two sides attacked and counterattacked all day long. The Confederate Army held their ground despite being heavily outnumbered. By nightfall the next day, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederates and his troops began retreating back to Virginia. Neither side was a winner at the Battle of Antietam. It was the deadliest day of the war with over 23,000 casualties. And we know that casualties means deaths. The Siege of Vicksburg. This siege took longer than the typical battle. It lasted about 6 weeks. Vicksburg was located on the Mississippi River and was the last major port held by the South. If the North could take Vicksburg and its port, the South would be cut off from the West. States such as Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana would be isolated from the rest of the South. On May 18, 1863, General Grant and the Union Army surrounded Vicksburg and fired cannons into the town for 6 weeks. The people of Vicksburg eventually ran out of food and supplies. July 4, 1863, the Confederates surrendered and Vicksburg was under the control of the Union. The importance of the Siege of Vicksburg is that this battle marked a major turning point in the Civil War in the favor of the Union. So now, after all of this time, the Confederates were winning the war. This battle was a turning point, and now the Union had control. The Battle of Gettysburg. July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg took place over 3 days in Pennsylvania. On the third day, General Lee ordered a final attack. Nearly 14,000 Confederate soldiers charged across open fields toward the Union Army. The Union soldiers were ready and killed or wounded about half of the Confederate soldiers. Lee's army was weakened and forced to retreat. The importance of the Battle of Gettysburg. This battle marked a major turning point again in the Civil War in favor of the Union. The Gettysburg Address. In 1863, President Lincoln gave a short speech at Gettysburg, known as the Gettysburg Address. He explained that the Union was fighting in the Civil War to ensure that American democracy would survive. The speech is famous for explaining the purpose of why we were fighting the Civil War. The Atlanta Campaign. General William Sherman led the Union Army in Tennessee. Sherman planned to attack Atlanta, Georgia, which was a major Confederate city. In May of 1864, Union soldiers marched into Georgia. The Confederates fought back all summer. Sherman's larger army finally captured Atlanta in September. Sherman's march to the sea. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman and his troops headed to Savannah, Georgia. On the way, Sherman used total war to make Southerners so tired of fighting that they would give up. Total war is destroying an enemy's resources, such as stealing their food, killing their animals, wrecking railroads, burning houses, etc. Appomattox Courthouse. By early 1865, General Lee's army was too weak to continue defending Richmond. Lee retreated and the Union captured Richmond. Near a town called Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrendered. General Grant allowed Lee's soldiers to return home. A few days later, Lee's soldiers marched past the Union army to surrender. The Union soldiers saluted their old enemies, and the war was over at last. Reconstruction. After the Civil War ended, the nation had to be reunited. The period when the South rejoined the Union is called Reconstruction. Americans did not agree on how to bring the South back into the Union. Some people wanted to punish the South, while others, such as President Abraham Lincoln, wanted to make it easy for the Southern states to rejoin. Lincoln's assassination. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated or killed by American actor John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's death shocked and saddened many people. The Vice President, Andrew Johnson, became the president. Johnson put Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction into action. You can see there on the side, I added 2 pictures of both Vice President Andrew Johnson and John Wilkes Booth. Black codes. Southern states quickly set up new state governments. The federal government forced them to abolish or end slavery. Most Southern states passed harsh laws called black codes. These laws limited former slaves to travel, vote, and work in certain jobs. So these codes or these laws did not allow people that were former slaves to travel. They were not allowed to vote, and they were not allowed to work in certain jobs. Freedmen's Bureau. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau, which gave food, clothing, medical care, and legal advice to poor blacks and whites. The Freedmen's Bureau set up hospitals, schools, and jobs for many people. Impeaching President Johnson. In 1867, Congress began its own Reconstruction plan. Congress forced Southern states to obey the laws. The states had to allow men, including blacks, to vote. Congress tried to remove President Johnson by voting to impeach him. To impeach means to charge a government official with a crime. Congress almost forced Johnson out of office, but they did not succeed, and he finished his presidency. Carpetbaggers and scalawags. I know what you're thinking. This is not a joke. Just bear with me. Southerners who helped the government during Reconstruction were known as scalawags, which was a slang word for an old, worthless horse. Some Northerners traveled south during Reconstruction in an effort to help rebuild the South. The Northerners were known as carpetbaggers because they often carried suitcases made of carpet materials. Southerners did not like carpetbaggers. Changes to the Constitution. During Reconstruction, 3 new amendments to the Constitution were created by Congress. These changes gave the national government more power than the states. They also protected the rights of African Americans. The 13th Amendment declared that slavery would no longer be allowed to exist in the United States. The 14th Amendment declared that the states could not limit the rights of citizens, which was known as the due process of the law. This means that everyone has equal rights, and those rights are protected by law. The 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote, no matter what their skin color was or if they had been slaves. Women were not allowed to vote until 1920. And if you think back, we have already talked about women's suffrage, and that entire time of women's suffrage was fighting for the rights for women to vote. So right now, during the Civil War, the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote, no matter the color of their skin, even if they had been slaves. The end of Reconstruction. Over time, people grew frustrated and disappointed with Reconstruction because they felt that it had not successfully reunited the nation. In 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes ended Reconstruction and ordered government soldiers to leave the South. With no protection, African Americans were unable to vote and lost their political power. Jim Crow laws. Southern states began passing Jim Crow laws. These laws kept African Americans separate from other Americans and made segregation legal. Segregation is the forced separation of races. Jim Crow laws segregated schools, hospitals, and even cemeteries. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a picture of a sign that says colored waiting room. These were the kinds of signs that were hung in different areas around the South, in schools and hospitals and cemeteries, different businesses, restaurants, to show how they were keeping people separate by the color of their skin. Why does this all matter? After Reconstruction, African Americans had to continue their struggle for freedom. For decades, Jim Crow laws prevented African Americans from exercising their rights. For those of you that don't know, a decade is equal to 10 years. So from decades with an S, that makes it plural. So that means it was more than 10 years, more than 20 years. African Americans had to continue to fight for their rights.